Good evening, everyone. It's an absolute delight to see you all here tonight. Welcome to Sydney Ideas. It's the University of Sydney's Public Talks program. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we stand, the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to the wisdom of elders past and present. We are on unceded land. This is and always will be Aboriginal land. My name's Demetria Grutzis. I'm Associate Professor in the Business School and also Academic Director of the Athena Swan Science in Australia Gender Equity Program. This program takes an evidence-based approach to explaining and understanding various metrics when it comes to progress on gender, intersectionality, equity, diversity and inclusion across the university. And this includes all faculties, schools, professional services units, students and staff. This evidence-based approach really holds us to account. It also allows us to start a conversation with the broader tertiary sector about these really important issues. I'm really proud to be leading this program at the University of Sydney along with a really tiny team of staff members, but also a broader team of really dedicated and committed staff and students across the university. We're really excited to be co-hosting this event tonight with Sydney Ideas. A couple of housekeeping things, a quick note before we get underway. We're live streaming and recording for on demand, so please be mindful of the cameras. We'd love to hear from you at any point throughout the evening. You can upload your questions on Slido and we'll get to these in the second half of the hour. You just pop into slido.com, submit the little code, which is Sydney Ideas, and here you can view, submit, and also upload your questions. And as I said, we'll get to these in the second half of the hour. For those of you who are with us in the audience, we also invite you to raise your questions in the second half of the hour. All you need to do is raise your hand and we'll have roving mics, which will come around. The title of this evening's discussion is Activating Allies for Gender Equality, and we have an amazing panel of speakers tonight, experts in their field, and I'm hoping that they will provide us with some insights into how we can go beyond the discourse and engagement to action and accountability. So hopefully we'll have some helpful insights by the end of this discussion. On that note, it's my very great pleasure to introduce our MC and host for this evening's event, Antoinette Lattouf. Antoinette is an author, a journalist, podcaster, diversity advocate, to name but a few of her many skills and talents. I'm also really privileged to call her a friend. So over to you, Antoinette. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Demetria. I'd like to introduce all of the panel to come and join me. So we've got a really big job ahead of us in the next 55 minutes. We're pretty much going to solve the patriarchy. We'll solve all of the issues, so take note. It's going to be easy. It's going to be fun. We're going to do it. We're going to spend the first 30 minutes where we have a chat, and then it is over to you, because I know everybody in this room or online has a real interest. We already have some of your questions, but there will be opportunities for some more. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any First Nations people with us in the room or virtually today. What an amazing panel. We have so much to get through. I may have intimidated the panel a little bit to make sure that they stick to time and we stick to our plan, because we want to make this as productive and robust as possible. Thank you so much, Elizabeth Broderick AO. Just stepped away from her role as UN Special Rapporteur and independent expert on discrimination against women and girls. Also the founder and convener of the Champions of Change Coalition, which was formerly the Male Champions of Change and Australia's longest-serving Sex Discrimination Commissioner. Thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us.
Thank you.
Professor Mustafa Ozbilgin, Professor of Organisational Behaviour at Brunel Business School in London, whose research focuses on workplace equality, diversity and inclusion, and also collaborates and research with Demetria and her team. Thank you so much for joining us. And also Tom Snow, Chair of Snow Medical Board and Chair of Equality Australia. And you may have seen in the news today the announcement of $100 million into immunology from Snow Medical. That's one of the biggest ever investments into medical research in Australia. Thank you. So I always like a little list. It makes my Virgo heart happy. And so we're going to approach this conversation in three ways. We're going to start on true allyship, what it is and why it's so important now, and then looking at some generational and intersectional differences and what challenges and opportunities they present. And then we're going to wrap up with some sort of practical tips and ways to ensure that those rhetoric and lovely promises are more than just words, and there are some accountability measures in place. So Elizabeth, I'll start with you. Why is male allyship so important now? I mean, it's always been important, but particularly for this moment in history.
Yeah, I think for this moment in history, what we're seeing globally, and I'm speaking here just about the work that I've been doing with the United Nations, is we're seeing a huge backlash against human rights generally, but particularly the rights of women and girls and LGBTI community. So if we look at when when women were able to express their human rights, enjoy their human rights, we'd be going back to the Beijing Platform for Action in 1995. That was the high water mark. And it's kind of gone, progressively to where we are today, where, as I said, we're seeing a backlash. Just to give you some examples of that, what we're seeing in the US in terms of women's reproductive rights, and particularly the lack of access to reproductive services. In half the states of the US today, abortion is not an option for women. We're seeing the issues around Afghanistan, Iran. We're seeing in Istanbul, in Turkey, we're seeing the convention, which is the Istanbul Convention on Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls, which was conceived and signed in Turkey. The Turkish government is now withdrawn from that, and that's having a contagion effect in that area. And even if we come into our region here, just Sri Lanka at the minute, there's a bill before the parliament which says that women no longer will be required to sign their marriage certificate. Their male guardian can do that on their behalf, or even coming up here into Indonesia with the criminalisation of intimate relationships before marriage, which disproportionately, is adversely impacts women and girls and also the LGBTI community. They're just a few that I want to put out there, but also coming back here to Australia now, is that even the Gender Compass, which came out just 2 weeks ago, shows that 59% of Australians fundamentally believe that gender equality is finished business. That's almost 60% of our population. So that's kind of the backlash that I'm talking about. And in an environment like that, if we don't have everyone on board, and particularly men who hold the levers of power in pretty much every nation of the world, not exclusively, but largely, if we don't have men stepping up with us, and people of all genders to actually focus on gender equality, then we have no chance of moving forward. So I think this moment, it's particularly important for anyone who's sitting on the fence, but particularly male allies, to step in with us and join us on this journey of gender equality.
And Tom, why do you think men need to stand up, and what impact can that have?
You mentioned the levers of power, and you can put that, you can frame that in terms of privilege, you can frame that in so many different ways. Quite simply, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem here. But let me take it from a different angle. on the marriage equality campaign, we advocated, and if I went up there as a gay man or a lesbian went up there and said, we should get married and it should, look, it should be equal, you're not going to get any press coverage, you're not going to get any traction. And so what we did was we quite systematically used people who had that privilege and who had that voice. And the more blokey the bloke, and the more, they came from regional news, Queensland or something like that. We had a crocodile hunter out there advocating for the gays. Didn't really understand what he's totally advocating, but they should have the same thing, and it was right. and so we have a position of power, and it's really important that we do that in a sensitive way. Like, we stand on the backs of generations of women and men as well, but primarily women who've fought the fight for years and years and years. It's important to acknowledge that. But we really do need to stand up there. And, I remember for myself, there was a thing at University of Melbourne where they had 6 white old men with honorary doctorates. And we probably all saw it on social media and go, oh, that's outrageous, and we posted it. And I did that, and then I went away. And it wasn't until a week later I woke up, and I'm like, wait a second. I am from a position of privilege here. It is important. And so I stood up, and it's stupid, and it's crazy, and it's unfair. But, I got coverage when other people wouldn't have. And so we need men to stand up and do that, whether it's in the public sphere or whether it's in work environments.
So you got coverage just by calling it out? Just by calling it out.
Well, there's 2 things. One, I was a bloke.
Yes.
A male, not a bloke really, come on. But, a white male with position of privilege, we were funding it, so we pulled funding. That was a power.
Yes.
But there's so many positions where men have that. Men have it in workplaces, men have it in universities, men have it in relationships in many cases. And so it's important that we all stand up and use what we have for the best.
Mustafa, I'll bring you in at this point. And I want to talk about how important it is, I guess, to dangle the carrot and communicate that gender equality benefits men too, and gender diverse people. Just looking in this room, I can count the amount of men on one hand, even though this is about activating male allies. What more needs to be done to, I'm not sure how many are online. I think from the registration, we had about 15% who identified as male. What more do we need to do to engage people? And is it fair to have to go, well, this is to lean into how this is going to benefit you to get their attention?
Actually, I give a different spin, positive spin maybe. If you look at the most recent, I'm hearing my own voice, which is disturbing me. I don't know how you coped with that. If you look at the most recent OECD survey, it shows that over 85% of leaders, predominantly male, are committed to equality. So that's a good starting point. But the survey identified that the primary reason why we don't make progress is the translation. The message gets lost in translation. We need to turn it into actions, like Tom highlighted, concrete actions. And this requires what Dimitria was saying, evidence-based work. What works within the context of... So I think not all men would be attracted to carrot. So we need to dangle different things in front of them. And I think that some of them will be convinced by the social case, moral case. They would have sophisticated moral knowledge. I think we shouldn't undermine men's knowledge. They would be, I think, at the core, as human beings, would be committed to equality because it's an important value. But I think what goes wrong with allyship processes is that we are also putting men on the spot rather than questioning the systems which prioritize patriarchy.
So as in putting individual men on the spot rather than showcasing or highlighting the system behind them.
That's right.
We're going to get back to that in our next section. But Tom, I often hear from men who probably fall into that 85% of leaders who say that they are, in theory, committed to gender equality, but then when it comes to saying certain things or acting in certain ways, similar sorts of things, it's really hard, it's fraud, I don't know what to say, I don't want to overstep, I don't want to say the wrong thing. Do you accept those sort of, that it is hard and that fear of getting it wrong is enough to not try?
I think it's a reasonable question to answer. And in fact, that's a totally right question to answer. And again, the analogy we have this in the LGBTIQ space, right? So we have our allies who are bigger supporters, and we need them, and thank you for those of them who are, to support us. But they sort of go, well, am I allowed to say that? Am I allowed to, people were looking for a license to say it. So I think that one of the key things is actually creating, an environment which actually is encouraging men to say, hey, come on, And so in every workplace, from the top, we should be saying, men, you are equally responsible for this, the whole way through the organisation, and not just at the top, not just at the bottom, but the whole way through predominantly senior leadership.
I'm sure in your role as Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Elizabeth, these sorts of things would have been put to you in the press. How do you respond to, but it's so hard for blokes these days, I don't want to get it wrong?
Yeah, no, you're
like that, with a bit of laughter.
Yeah, a bit of laughter. No, actually, it's quite hard for women as well. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I never kind of try to take dignity from an individual. I mean, as a human rights advocate, as someone who fundamentally believes in human rights, if you say totally something that's outrageous, I won't strip you of dignity, but I'll try and find some common ground. So I totally agree with you. What we need to do is make the safe space, but I do think on occasion we need to call men out, and we need to call the patriarchy out, because we're all operating in a system of patriarchy, but if encouraging men to examine their own power and privilege, and not just get away with an excuse, it's so complex, and you women have got it sorted anyway. No, that is not good enough anymore. We need everyone on board, and we'll help you learn, because it is hugely complex. We'll help you learn. We won't dump on you from a huge height, but we are expecting you to take equal responsibility with us for change.
Yeah, just in the media space, that's where a lot of sort of my advocacy and equity experience is. When historically men have gotten it wrong, they usually get 3 TV shows or another column or a billboard. The repercussions, is it fair to say, the repercussions for getting it wrong or saying the wrong thing are often not very big.
Yeah.
Mustafa, it could go in another direction where people overstep. Talk me through saviour complex.
Yes, saviour complex happens when a male ally brings a woman under their wing, thinking that this will provide equality of opportunity, expand the zone for gender equality. But that's not the aim of allyship, if it's going to be an effective allyship, because that's a very ineffective way, and it makes other men think that an unfair game is played. So what they need to do if they want to show allyship is to show allyship to a cause and change the systems that disadvantage women. Go back to their organizations and consider their systems and structures, the context that provide gender inequality, that perpetuate gender inequality, rather than to try and save individual women. And it's also a very patronizing relationship for women. Women don't need fixing. Systems need fixing.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
I want to talk about some of the sort of generational differences and challenges. Mustafa, what do you think the best way for the Gen X generation to address that growing breed or flavour of misogyny that is developing in young men who are spending a lot of time online?
I think Gen X, we are responsible for the failure of gender equality interventions, so we should not hold young men responsible for the misogyny that they are holding, because we are more misogynist than younger men. Younger men are, I find them more cognizant of social justice values. But younger men are also influenced, are susceptible, because as Generation X and boomers, we have hoarded actually so much wealth, and we have destroyed the future of younger generations. So their misogyny is a backlash against what we have done wrong.
So do you think then too much attention is paid on those, influenced by the Andrew Tates of it? There's so much conversation, and there's a lot of concern, probably rightly so, but do you think it's disproportionate, or the gaze or the concern is misdirected?
I think we need to, going back to Dimitrios and Liz's point about data and evidence, we have not done enough to show generation of young men that gender equality is important value, is a virtue for all. And as a result, some of them have become susceptible. And Andrew Tate, all of my students are quoting Andrew Tate, and I use Andrew Tate as a talking point, and then encourage students to collect evidence to show Andrew Tate's points hold value in science, social science. So it's very important to tackle these emerging forms of misogyny.
Tom, do you have any suggestions on what you've seen? I'll start that again. I'm keen to get an idea of any of your observations of the different ways in which allyship has been exercised amongst different generations from, boomers, Gen X. Are you seeing those sorts of differences, and what can we learn from them?
I think we're seeing a lot of different changes through generations, and the most obvious one is the change between, say, my parents' generation and my generation. And you see that in attitudes to women, and that is a proxy for attitudes to, race, it's a proxy for LGBTIQ people, it's a proxy for all sorts of attitudes around discrimination. So, and we saw this in the marriage equality campaign. We saw that someone who was 40 was almost certainly going to vote yes. Someone who was 50 probably was on the margin. Someone who's 60 was most likely to vote no. And we see that in all attitudes. So that it is an amazingly positive thing. And I think that all credit to all the people that have driven that change, because there's been a huge amount of people that do it. When we go to the younger generations, it starts to get really complicated. And I think you were alluding to this earlier, is that, and both of you, there's a polarisation happening that's quite scary. So what you see, when you measure the average and the mean, attitudes are actually, my reading of the data, are getting better on issues including attitudes to women in workplaces and LGBTIQ Australians and other attitudes. But there is an increasingly large rump of predominantly men who are predominantly often a bit disadvantaged, who are not doing as well economically, who have attitudes that women, the policies towards women, let's say in workplaces, this is one measure I've seen, are disadvantaging them, and so women are getting a better deal. Now, we know, everyone in this room knows that's not true. But there is that perception. And so how do you, what do you do to fight that? I mean, number one, it's not a zero-sum game, right? It is not, we are all better off if we treat everyone equally and decently in the workplace and give everyone opportunity. That is best for everyone. It's best for white men, it's best for everyone. And so teaching that is hard. But, there's a whole lot of problems around, these people, a lot of these people are struggling economically, and so often it's a function of society is becoming more unequal, and so we've got to address things like how the least advantaged in society are being treated, and that's going to improve things. So there's a lot of work we can do, but there is an increasing concern, and you're talking about it on the right, the far right. They're targeting these people as men, and it's really sad.
And the other thing I think is, we're going through such change at the minute, accelerated digitisation, climate change, increasing inequality, all those things. And I think in a period of disequilibrium, people want to go back to what they know, and that's back to tradition. When men were men and women were women, and we all had defined roles and whatever. And I think that's another reason that we're seeing such, polarity and such unease, particularly in certain cohorts, around gender equality. But you're absolutely right. The challenge is, how do we help everyone see that gender equality benefits everyone? As you say, it's not a zero-sum game.
And Liz, we had a few questions ahead of the event, all of which recognise that there's more work to be done to achieve gender equality, and activating male allies is really important. But time and time again, the issue was raised, how do we ensure that gender equality is intersectional and includes women with disability, queer women, First Nations, migrant refugee? How do we ensure that they're not being overlooked and that we're not just activating allies and progress for a certain type of woman?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's actually women like me, educated white women. The women's movement in this country has lifted us disproportionately to my Aboriginal sisters, women from culturally diverse backgrounds. And that's, I think, one of the failures of the women's movement in this country. So if we want, a leadership in this country which represents the diversity, we need to lift women who come from a different starting point to me to a much greater height. So how do we do that? I actually don't think it's on the women themselves. I think it's actually, the women with disabilities, the lesbian women, the trans women. It's actually on organisations to actually ensure that their strategies and policies, the way they the way they hire people, the way they promote people, that they've got strategies in place which recognises the different starting points of different women. And I think we just haven't done a good enough job in helping everyone see that the system that exists today is not fair. It's not treating women equally, diverse women. And in fact, even if I look at men are as diverse as women. There'll be men who are impoverished, who have low educational, low socioeconomic status. They will be doing disproportionately worse as well. So there's that. The other thing I would say is the Champions of Change have done some amazing work around power. So they said, look, we could have an infinite number of strategies, addressing, say, an Aboriginal woman with a disability, a woman, of colour with, certain attributes. Instead of that, why wouldn't we look at what is common amongst all of us, and that is our access to or lack of access to power? Because how organisational systems and structures distribute power is what means that I get ahead and my Aboriginal sister doesn't. So what if we started to interrogate that, and each of us who lead and have power and influence, so let's start interrogating, where do we spend our time? Who do we empower? How many friends with disability do we have, women with disability? How many Aboriginal friends? Just really starting to understand that. And then if we are going to lead for equality, then let's start to address some of those things. So let's start to actively and intentionally engage, particularly with the diversity of women, who can tell us about their lived experience and what needs to shift if we're to create organisations where everyone can thrive.
And on that, Mustafa, what's your advice for organisations on managing those intersectional challenges in equality programs to make sure that they, yes, engage men, but they encourage them to be part of driving that change, but not only driving that change for those people who look like their sisters or mothers or partners?
Yes. I have a radical suggestion for that, for organizations in terms of intersectionality. We cannot continue to look at intersectionality as an individual property. We need to start looking at intersectionality as an institutional property. This institution has a gender. It is closer to men or is closer to women. This institution has a race. It's racialized. It provides better outcomes for certain racial groups, racialized groups. Similarly, this institution has a sexual orientation, provides differential outcomes. So we need to look at keenly the intersectionality of the institution rather than we need to leave individuals alone. They don't need fixing. In terms of disadvantage, they don't need fixing. What we need to do is to make sure that our organizations do not continue with their traditional way of discriminating across these categories. And looking at intersections of the institution is better, but we need to continue collecting individual data and cross-cut the data to see what kind of outcomes that individuals that interface with those organizations have. We don't wake up every day thinking, okay, I'm a gay man. But when we meet the police, suddenly your sexual orientation becomes salient. Similarly, you don't always think you are a woman unless you meet the institution that denigrates your gender. So what we need to have is to create a safe space for all justice for all within organizations, and that requires organizational development. Most of our intersectional efforts remain stunted at the point of individuals, fragmenting to the point of nonsense. Instead, we can look at the organizations and collect as much data as possible from individuals to make sure that organizations, to understand organizations creating happiness and unhappiness, satisfaction, dissatisfaction, happiness and misery, actually, at a different measure for different groups. And then looking at the underlying mechanisms and systems, and then developing those towards equality. So I have a proposition, different proposition to intersectionality, looking at the organizations instead of individuals.
Obviously, data is at the heart of accountability, and good data. As Australians, this is something Dimitri and I speak a lot about. We don't have a good record, particularly on the gender front, of having that intersectional data. Even our census, we don't have a census that really captures the robustness of who Australia is. And this is a good segue for us to talk about accountability, and no doubt data is going to come into that, and some practical tips. In about 10 minutes, we'll be handing over to the audience online and in the room, so get your questions ready. I know everybody who's in attendance has a keen interest in walking away with as much useful information and tips as possible. So, Tom, how do you suggest we move men from engagement and saying the right things and having the right intention to actual accountability?
Sorry, I had to laugh on the data question you said before. We've had to take the ABS to the High Courts twice now. We've had to sue them twice to get LGBTIQ people included in the data, and it's just like, you can't do it.
Yeah.
So, how do we measure? If you're not measured, you're not counted, basically. So, sorry. How do we get men accountable? I'm thinking about organisations at the moment.
Yeah,
and I think there's a real roadblock in organisations. What we see, we've surveyed all the universities and medical research institutes as part of what we've done in quite a detailed thing across 32 different measures, etc. And what it shows, a lot of it's very positive. A lot of great work's happening. What's really interesting is at the very top, we're doing really, really well. At the very bottom, we're doing really, really well, but there's this point in between, and this applies, interestingly, we see it not only at academic institutions, but we see it in workplaces as well. It's senior upper-level management who are not getting the message, are not sending that message through about it. So I really think that it's that next layer down. So it's a professorial level, dean level at a university. It's line manager in an institution, in a company. They're the people we need to convince. They're the ones we need to make accountable, and we need to get outcomes focused. I think we've spent a lot of time in this country, and to great success, by the way, talking about inputs. We need to have this and that, all these things to make it right for women to be treated right. I think that's great. But there does come a time where you say, well, if you're not doing it right, or if you've only got women in your HR department and your marketing department, but not in the real actual money-making departments, you need to stand up to that. And so part of it is reporting that, and then part of it is then saying, what is an acceptable level? And sure, it may not be 50-50 all the time, but it's unacceptable. So we should just call it out for what it is. It's unacceptable. And report it and do it. So, we measure all the universities on all sorts of different levels, and I know there's some people at Sydney University who are involved in us with that here. Sydney Uni is doing the best of all of our institutions, so congratulations to Sydney. Really, you deserve congratulations for that. But in many measures, they're not, and we're helping them with that. We've raised that with them, and then other institutions are way behind, and it's calling them out on that. And eventually, we're going to say, you're not in if you don't fix up this, this, and this. But that needs to be more public, and that information needs to be, in the public sphere, and ultimately, people need to call them out.
And Antoinette, because I totally agree with that, and I think having the courage to call them out is just so important. But can I also just add to that, one of the other ways, I think, to engagement, and we learnt this when we did a review into Australia's military, so looking at the treatment of women in the military. So we flew to a lot of deployed bases as well, and what we found is that women would tell us stories that they'd never told before because they just didn't feel safe enough to tell stories. And out of that, we came to understand that actually helping leaders see the human harm that's actually happening on their watch because of the inequality is absolutely critical to getting them to step up and take more intentional action. And I still remember the first session that we held. We had an incredible woman who'd duxed Royal Military College Duntrue, and she was exactly the talent that the Army needed. And she'd had, truly unacceptable service issues that had happened, and we were able to bring her together with the Chief of Army. We actually asked her to come to bring a support person. She brought her beautiful mother, and we sat down, the Chief of Army, this woman and her mother and me, to get this conversation started about what had happened to her. And I still remember, how do you get these conversations about human harm happening? But it was that young woman, she looked at the Chief of Army and she said, "Sir, I feel so nervous." And he just looked at her and he said, "You know what, I'm really scared too." And she went on to tell her story about going on exercise when no one spoke to her for months on end. She was sexually assaulted by her instructor, the very person she should have been able to go to for advice. And then when she'd tried to speak out about it, she'd, had a career decimated as a result of that. And I think, to be able to do that, the military went on and did that at scale. They did 800 of these sessions. But when you do that and you have this environment of shared vulnerability, I call it, then you can create a whole cohort of change makers in a really conservative organisation like the military, who will then not tolerate the excuses which many organisations come up with. So it is a challenge to make that happen at scale, but we've found that that's probably one of the most single kind of, important interventions that you can make to shift culture and the treatment of women.
And I understand in Geneva last month, the first ever paper on men's accountability and men's engagement was launched. Can you talk me through what's, some quick points from that?
Yeah, it's interesting because a few years ago, if you had have suggested, our mandate had have suggested, well, actually we need men to step up with us, that was like, no, this is women's business. But the great thing is, just last month our working group launched a paper which looked at how do we take men from just being engaged in gender equality to taking equal accountability for delivering gender equality. And we presented it to many of the ambassadors, many nation states across the world, just helping them see in this context as well, we need everyone getting on board. And I think the ramifications of that, of having, new normative standards which will talk about men's engagement, men's involvement, because men were not involved back in 1995 at the Beijing Platform for Action. They were just not part of the picture. Now, not only are they part of a picture, but we've got stated aspirations and for what's necessary as well. I mean, firstly, it's about men actually being transparent about what they're doing. Secondly, that they're putting women's human rights at the centre of their action, and that their actions are informed by the lived experiences of women as well. I think having some lessons learnt and strong standards on that will be really important across the world. So anyway, watch this space. There's some good work happening in many, many countries, including some great developing nations as well.
And Mustafa, can you talk us through reverse allyship and any other practical initiatives that have worked?
Yes, sure. We've looked at FTSE 500 companies in terms of men's allyship for gender equality, and we tried to identify effective and ineffective methods of allyship. One of the effective methods appeared to be reverse allyship, where the ally applied some critical listening and understood women's concerns in the workplace, concerns of safety, concerns of inequality, concerns of interpersonal relationships, access to power and resources. Then, listening to those concerns, translated those concerns in a reverse fashion to organizational design. So, allies became co-designers of organizations to make them more egalitarian. Unlike this is a great contrast to a very ineffective method which is based on male allies thinking that There is a male allies showing a trust deficit to women and putting them through hoops, such as education, mentoring, and a lot of fixing practices. When they start listening and start understanding the needs of women to have better inclusion in the workplace, and then turn these demands into design and make women also not only co-designers but co-participants and co-owners of the organizations, then it is very effective. And we have seen that male allies who have achieved that, their companies were showing higher forms of gender equality. So it's the reverse approach, which is based on trust and co-ownership.
It's now time for your interaction. We already have so many great questions that have come through on Slido, so thank you for those listening at home or at work who are tuning in. I'm going to start, and feel free, whoever would like to answer, feel free to jump in. I quite like this one. I'm not very high up at any of the organisations I work at. What can I do to improve the treatment of women at work?
Is that from a man? Or?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it sounds like it's from a man who's not particularly senior but wants to see the treatment of to be a good ally, but may not have as much power in an organisation. Tom, do you?
I got 3 basic practical suggestions. Yeah. One, and this applies if you do have power as well, but to everyone. One, just talk about it all the time. Hey, we're here to treat people decently. This is important. This is important to the organisation. It's a core goal of the organisation. This is how we're going to achieve. 2, I think a lot of the issues are often casual sexism. Just casually, just things happen. Just call it out. Just call it out. Just say, and you don't have to make a big thing about it a lot of the time. You just go, oh yeah, no, that's not how we behave in this place. I don't think that's appropriate in that situation. Or I think you could have worded that a bit differently. Or did you really need to mansplain that to her? Just call out little things. And you don't make someone feel bad about it. Just put it and then just move on. 3, the third one was in any environment, like whether it's a meeting or a group or an awards or whatever it is, just think. After you get your preliminary, who's going to be in that meeting or that who's in that, look, what's the ratio of women to men here, or what's the, have we included some people who are not white, if we included some people who might not be straight or something. Just think about it every single time, and you just see every time how your systemic bias is just happening all the time, and then if you think about it, you go, oh yeah, no, we probably got that wrong. Who have we missed out? Who's probably better than the other people there? So there's 3 little practical things.
Very
then
good.
maybe bring it to the family as well, because I think we often forget about the family, and I think gender equality starts in the family. Human rights starts at home, I believe. So I mean, as a man in a family as well, who's doing most of the unpaid work, who's looking after the kids, who's unstacking the dishwasher, who's doing the lawn, who's putting all those types of things. I think just being able to just reflect on that and then maybe make some small shifts as well. And most importantly, always modelling respect at home, because what we model at home, our children will take into their later lives. So I think if we want a world which is equal, which is respectful, we have to start by modelling that there.
Wonderful. Anybody in the room have a question? Okay, there's always... Oh, there we are, a couple in the front.
Hi. Look, I would like to think that I have a few allies at home with a husband and 3 young school-aged boys. What are the types of conversations that we need to be having with them, and what role does schools play in this conversation?
Who wants to jump in? Don't be polite, go on.
I'll tell you what, all the men do all the work in our house.
I think we can move from empathy, assumed empathy, towards sharing of responsibility, as Liz highlighted, sharing of domestic work. Most of the time, men are brought up as really poor partners. They don't pull their weight as children in cooking, doing domestic work. So just realizing that they have to have their share, even as children, boys, is very important. I think we need to go beyond just showing empathy towards women, but realizing that we have half the share of the work at home. And also schools are trying to do their best, but I think parental influence is now pulling them down. There is traditionalization, and parents think that they know best about curriculum, and they're trying to, our generation is horrible, Generation X. I lost trust in them, and they interfere with school curriculum and even scientific curriculum to assert their own beliefs and ideologies. Unfortunately, I'm a skeptic about belief. Belief always beats knowledge. That's why we need to turn to norms. We need to create normative structures around schools, involvement of parents in schoolwork.
Can I just add one thing? I think speaking to young men about pornography is really important. And we don't have those conversations enough. Because if you're getting your sex education from porn, you're believing that women should be in subservient positions, that they enjoy violence. I mean, things like that. So I think some of those issues around consent, comprehensive sexuality education, because I couldn't agree more, Mustafa, what we're seeing across the world, and it's part of a backlash that I talked about originally, is, the consent and comprehensive sexuality education. Firstly, that's a, demonic word. When you talk about that, you'll get a really strong reaction from nation states who just want to keep with a very traditional sex education. So I think we need to have the conversations that many schools are not giving, and that, they're hard to talk about. But these things are the reality of young boys' lives. I mean, the Andrew Tate, if you're following Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson knows, you're getting a particular view, and we need to talk about other things and help boys see that pornography is part of a fantasy land. It's not real life. And part of the reason I say that is many young women I speak to, when I ask what is the main issues that you care about, they talk about what boys want us to do because of the porn they've been watching and whatever, and we don't feel comfortable about that. So I think as mothers particularly, and as parents, if we can't actually talk about those things, then who else is going to talk to young boys about that?
Another question online points to the fact that while the data we've collected on gender is imperfect and incomplete, we're gathering more and more information. But is there a sense or any data on allyship? Do we know? Are we able to quantify if it's increasing or decreasing, or is this just a bit of a sense of the room?
I think allyship is on the increase, definitely, in terms of top leadership positions. International surveys show that. I show the Society for Human Resource Management from the US, showing over the years how their leaders are increasingly committed. But a lot of the allyship claims...
Declaring they are committed.
Declaring allyship is there, but translating that into middle-level management practices. That's why I really agree with Tom. We need to hold the middle-level managers accountable for leadership messages, but they need practical tools. There are many now, so there is no excuse.
And another yes, round of applause for that. And any other questions from the room?
Can I, I'm a young teenager, obviously, and I just wanted to know, I have some insight, and I wanted to on how to get men to be invested in this movement. I was wondering if you were interested.
In hearing it?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. All right. So I think it's. So I'm going to take the analogy of when investors invest into a business. If you want to have a lot of investors into your business, you have to show them how this could benefit them. So for the gender equality, I think there should be more of a focus on how this could benefit men. I really like the focus on like obviously women's rights, but there's also, I think, a lot of things that are inequalities for men that I think should be looked on, especially with mental health of young men, as suicide rates for men are very high. So I think, and especially this is not women, it's gender equality. So if you want to have a lot of men that are allies to this movement, I would also focus on the more masculine side as well as the feminine side of the argument. And when there is someone that comes along and says something new, like Andrew Tate, that says that talks about men's mental health, albeit Andrew Tate says a lot of misogynistic things, but I think his core message for men and what he has done for me and my friends has been amazing, as well as Jordan Peterson. They both have some misogynistic views. I won't deny that, but I think their core message, and they also, you talked about pornography, they go against pornography, and I think, canceling them certainly isn't the best option, and every day in school I hear about feminism, and I think I'm a feminist, I adore this movement, but every day, especially in English class, more than 2/3 of our curriculum is focused on feminism, and just men, we kind of feel like, hey, who's advocating for us? And when there's someone that is advocating for us, like Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson, they get cancelled.
Thank you for that honesty and for sharing your perspective. I think it's really brave to come to an event and share your experience and honesty. I'm going to throw to you, Mustafa, because I think this is a question I put.
Fantastic contribution. Thank you so much for being so brave and open about Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson. And most of my students are like you. They bring quotes from these two people, and then we discuss where they are helping, where they are not helping. And I also really applaud you for raising the issue of mental health for men. Recently, I completed a study on suicide dissidents, looking at their letters and identifying reasons why predominantly men commit suicide in workplaces. And they suffer dehumanization and they suffer misrecognition. These were the key two reasons why men tend to commit suicide. And we really need to develop intersectional understanding. And you can see even with this example that we tend to individualize responsibility, and it's not the way to go about this. Men are partners in changing institutions, changing societies. They are not the enemy. I think we should recognize that. We need to move the responsibility from the level of individual to the level of organizations and the state. Our countries are very good at crafting individual responsibility and letting us, hate each other.
Do you think then there are some failures? Because there is so much evidence about the ways in which men also benefit from gender equality, including mental health, workplace satisfaction, so many different areas. The evidence is there. Are we not, as a society, communicating that well enough? Because there is an appeal of Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson. They are speaking about things. Is it that, is there a lack, or is there something that we need to reflect on as storytellers or tertiary institutions that we're not doing well enough in sending those messages? Or is there always those who are going to say, what about me?
Well, I think we have another study looking at the SAGE equivalent in the UK, which is Athena Swan. Over 10 years, it's really gender equality in universities helped reduction of collective turnover. It's a really amazing finding. So if organizations commit to gender equality, it has great benefits, not only for women, but also for men staying at work. I mean, turnover is one of the poor outcomes of inequality we knew the association, but with this study we have shown. And what our study was really important, significant in terms of findings, is that short-term commitment doesn't pay. We need to see this as a long project, long walk towards equality. And we need to get our organizations to commit to a long project of change, because we need to change organizations. They don't change over time. Like, they don't change suddenly. We need to make sure, we have looked at a period of 10 years. So young men will benefit, our study shows, collectively. Young men, young women will benefit if we stick to the plan of and commit to gender equality.
Liz, any quick thoughts on this about, we know the benefits to men. Are they not being communicated? Is that a way to activate allies, especially young allies?
I think it is a good way. We need to have more focus on that. I mean, I'm particularly thinking of the strength of a relationship between men and their children. I mean, we know where men are more involved in care, that the relationship with the child across the life cycle is much better. There's a lot of research which shows there's greater intimacy between men and women when there's equal participation in unpaid work, all those things. So I think that is important. But I'm really fascinated because, you look at Andrew Tate. Is he currently in Romania on house arrest for, alleged human trafficking? It's interesting what you say, because there is some great messages from advocates like Andrew Tate and also Jordan Peterson. If you want to get ahead in life, get up and make your bed. It's 12 rules for life. But I just wonder how we can, hold that together with some of the deeply misogynistic views that men like those two men hold. And maybe we just say, well, I'm listening to him on this part, but I'm absolutely not listening to him on that part. But I do worry there's a lot of young men who are listening to him on both parts. And that's what I think, can be quite problematic, particularly in the treatment of women in terms of violence against women. And let's remember that 2 weeks ago, in a period of 10 days, 5 women were murdered by either their current or their former intimate partner. And we know the most protective thing to keep women safe, or keep us all safe, is those men who fundamentally believe in gender equality. Their propensity to commit violence against women is almost zero. So that's where we need to head in terms of the attitude that we hold. So I'm just trying to wrestle with that. And I love to be part one day on the wall, fly on the wall of your conversation, Mustafa, with your young students about justifying certain arguments, particularly as they relate to gender equality from those people. But
not only gender equality, they also bring news items from ultra-right-wing press around migrants stealing jobs and LGBT mafia.
And trans exclusion.
Trans exclusion. We've written a paper inspired by the conversations in class around TERF arguments, trans exclusionary arguments, and how they cannot be supported by social science evidence. All these fears around trans exclusion. And British political context is very toxic at the moment, so it really provides a fertile ground for discussing these things.
I have one last question because it's come up a couple of times online, but I'm going to give you a 30-second challenge each to answer it, because I'm a stickler for time and we're finishing bang on 7. A few people have asked about quotas. How much evidence do we have that they work and they're needed?
They do work. They are needed, but we need to look at the talent pipeline. If there is a bottleneck in the talent pipeline, that is the effective way of solving it. They are short-term measures to break men's resistance to women's equality in positions of power and authority. But if there is no bottleneck, there is no need for quotas.
I agree with everything Mustafa says. Ditto. But as you say, they are temporary special measures put in place for the achievement of a legitimate aim, which is gender equality. Immediately, that legitimate aim is achieved. And if you look at Norway, they've actually rescinded, I think, their quota legislation and whatever. So,
30 seconds.
Absolutely, I agree with everything, and it should apply to political parties too.
Okay, wonderful. I will add my 20 seconds. There's some research that came out that yes, quotas might work, but in a CEO level, if the inclusion part of the diversity, equity, inclusion, if the inclusion part doesn't work, they won't last.
Yeah.
And in 84% of cases of this study, that female CEO or leader who then departed because of that glass cliff, guess who she was replaced by? A man. And so quotas may work in a system where there is also, inclusion all across the organisation. Thank you so much for your time and your questions. That is all we have time for. Thank you for our wonderful panel. I know we could speak forever. Huge round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.